Under a pale, misty moon, Kyle wandered through a forgotten cemetery on the outskirts of town. It was the perfect place for his favorite pastime, ghost hunting. Armed with a flashlight and his camera, he moved through the iron-wrought gate, half expecting it to creak like in the movies, but it was silent. The silence made him uneasy. There was no wind, no rustle of leaves, just the faint crunch of gravel beneath his feet. The air smelled of damp earth, and tombstones stretched out before him in uneven rows, some cracked and leaning, others weathered into oblivion. Many were nameless, others bore dates from centuries past. A chill prickled the back of Kyle's neck, but he shook it off and focused on his mission. He'd heard rumors about this cemetery, a place whispered to be cursed. People said they felt like they were being watched here, but no one ever saw anything. A haunted place with no hauntings, just cold, oppressive dread. Kyle found himself standing before a large mausoleum, its doors carved with strange symbols. They were nothing he recognized, and something about their shape seemed to draw him in, pulling at his thoughts. He raised his camera, zooming in on the symbols, trying to make sense of them through the lens. The air grew colder, and he could see his breath in wispy clouds, though it was only early autumn. Suddenly, a faint sound echoed from behind him. It was like a whisper, just on the edge of his hearing, barely there. He spun around, his flashlight cutting through the shadows, but saw nothing. He strained his ears, but the night had returned to its unnatural silence. Trying to shake off the feeling, he turned back to the mausoleum and touched the door, feeling its rough, chilled surface under his hand. The moment his fingers brushed against the stone, a deep, resonant hum vibrated through his bones. His hand dropped back, and he stumbled away, his breath quickening. As he backed up, his heel caught on something. He looked down and saw a ring of flowers, rotted and blackened, lying around the base of a nearby grave. They looked freshly dead. The leaves were still pliable, the petals soft, though they were the color of ash. He snapped a photo and crouched down for a closer look. That was when he saw the inscription on the grave. Our sweet Kyle, beloved and missed. A chill far colder than the night seeped into his bones. He blinked and shook his head, certain he was seeing things. The inscription couldn't have said his name. He looked again, but there it was, engraved clearly in the old stone. He stumbled back, heart pounding, and turned to leave, but froze as he saw figures standing among the graves. There were dozens of them, shadowy and indistinct, barely more than silhouettes. Their heads were bowed, hands clasped in front of them, as if in mourning. They surrounded him on all sides, their dark eyes locked on him. He swung his flashlight toward one of them, but the beam passed through it, striking a tombstone on the other side. The figure did not move. Kyle's breaths came in sharp gasps, and he could feel his heartbeat thundering in his ears. He reached for his camera, lifting it to his eye to capture the figures, but when he looked through the lens, they were gone. Lowering the camera, they were there again, staring. Who are you?" he managed to stammer. The figures remained silent, their heads tilted as if they couldn't quite understand his question. Slowly, the nearest figure lifted a hand, pointing behind him. He turned, following their gesture, and found himself staring at the mausoleum again, but this time the door was slightly ajar, revealing darkness within. A pull, stronger than before, gripped him, urging him toward it. The sound of whispers grew louder, merging into a low, continuous hum. He couldn't resist. His feet moved without his command, his body obeying an ancient, unseen force. He stepped through the doorway, and the world around him dissolved into shadow. Inside, he found himself in a narrow corridor lined with mirrors. They stretched from floor to ceiling, so that his reflection seemed to go on forever. His face looked pale, gaunt, even unfamiliar in the dim light. Shadows danced across his reflection, shapes that moved where they shouldn't. He raised his hand, and his reflection mimicked the movement, but his reflection's eyes were different. Dull, hollow, almost dead. The whispers grew louder, filling the corridor, and he could make out words now, voices calling his name, begging him to remember something. He felt a pull in his mind, a hidden memory surfacing, but it was blurry, just out of reach. His gaze drifted to the mirrors, and he saw his reflection staring back with a grim smile. The reflection raised a hand, waving goodbye, and Kyle suddenly understood. The whispers were his memories, the life he'd once lived, the moments he'd forgotten, the people who had loved him. He was dead, had been for years, wandering in the cemetery where he'd been laid to rest. His nightly ghost hunts, his obsession with the dead, they were all that remained of him, the last echoes of a lost soul. The mirror shattered, and Kyle's reflection vanished, leaving only darkness. He felt himself dissolving, fading into the shadow, becoming just another memory in the cemetery, a faint whisper in the night, forever forgotten. Under a sky choked with heavy clouds, Sarah parked her car at the edge of the old Blackwood Cemetery. She'd heard stories about the place for years, stories she dismissed as local superstition. Tonight, though, something pulled her here. She couldn't quite explain it. It felt like the cemetery was calling her, a relentless whisper at the edge of her thoughts. As she stepped through the iron gates, the wind died down, and an eerie silence blanketed the place. Tombstones lay scattered haphazardly, some tilted, others cracked, like they had been abandoned long before they became graves. A rotten, earthy smell hung in the air, mixing with the faint trace of something metallic. Sarah's flashlight cut through the thickening fog as she walked deeper into the cemetery. Her footsteps echoed against the silence, each one sounding louder than the last. She tried to shake the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. A crow perched on a dead tree cawed, startling her. Its voice was low and grating, more a guttural sound than a cry. She paused, catching her breath, and turned to look around. That's when she saw the mausoleum, a small stone building half sunken into the earth, covered in moss and vines. Its door was slightly ajar, as though inviting her in. She hesitated, feeling a chill run down her spine. Her instincts told her to turn around to leave, but that pull, that strange urge, was stronger than her fear. She stepped up to the door, peering into the darkness within. It was pitch black, but she could make out the faintest outline of a stone coffin at the center of the room. She pushed the door open further, and a rush of cold air enveloped her. Inside, the air was thick and damp, the smell of decay nearly overwhelming. Her flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing beside the coffin, watching her, with hollow, empty eyes. Her heart skipped a beat, and she swung the flashlight back, but there was nothing there. Just shadows. She took a step inside, her curiosity overpowering her fear, and moved closer to the coffin. The stone was carved with intricate symbols, runes that looked like they'd been worn down over centuries. She traced one of them with her finger, feeling the rough stone beneath her touch. A low, echoing whisper filled the room. She froze, trying to locate the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The words were unintelligible, a mixture of sounds that didn't belong to any language she knew. Her breath quickened and she looked around, her eyes darting to every corner, expecting to see something emerge from the shadows. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and she felt an icy hand grip her shoulder. She spun around, but no one was there. Her flashlight flickered again, and this time, the figure beside the coffin appeared more clearly. It was a man, his face gaunt, eyes sunken, skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Paralyzed with fear, Sarah watched as the figure raised a hand, pointing toward the coffin. She could see now that the lid was slightly open, a sliver of darkness beckoning her. Against every instinct, she reached out, her fingers gripping the edge of the coffin lid. Slowly, she pulled it open, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might echo off the walls. Inside was herself. She stared down at her own lifeless body, her face as pale as the man's, her eyes open and unseeing, a look of horror frozen on her face. She stumbled back, her mind reeling, unable to process what she was seeing. The man's hollow eyes met hers, and he whispered, "You've always been here." The realization hit her like ice water. She was dead. She'd been here all along, a restless soul trapped in this cemetery, unable to remember her own death. The stories she'd heard, the whispers that drew her here, they were her memories, fragments of a life that had ended long ago. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The fog thickened and the world began to fade. The man's face dissolved into shadow, leaving her alone in the darkness, forgotten in the Blackwood Cemetery, just another lost soul. It was close to midnight when Lucas found himself walking along the dark, deserted path that wound through Briar Hollow Cemetery. He was a new night guard, replacing the old one who had quit suddenly, refusing to say why. Most people warned him about taking the job. They whispered about the strange happenings that plagued the cemetery after dark. Lucas, a skeptic, dismissed it all as town gossip. Armed with a flashlight and a radio, he felt more than prepared to handle a quiet night. But as he passed through the rows of headstones, an unsettling silence pressed down on him. The chirping of crickets had stopped, and there wasn't so much as a breeze. Everything felt frozen. As he walked, his flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows. A broken statue caught his eye. A weathered angel, its face cracked and one wing missing. The statue seemed almost alive in the dim light, its hollow eyes staring right at him. He shook off the feeling, chalking it up to his imagination. He turned his flashlight away, only to hear the faintest sound of crunching leaves behind him. He whipped around, his light piercing the darkness, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. "Must be a raccoon or something," he muttered, though a creeping dread settled in his stomach. He continued down the path, quickening his pace, eager to finish his rounds. Then he heard it again, but closer this time. The unmistakable sound of footsteps following him, slowly and deliberately. Lucas's heart began to pound, but he forced himself to stay calm. "It's just an echo," he told himself. "Just my own footsteps bouncing off the tombstones." But as he stopped walking, the footsteps continued, drawing closer and closer. He turned, holding his flashlight steady, and called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" His voice echoed back to him, but there was no response. He waited, breath held, straining his ears. Silence. His flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, he thought he saw a shadow move behind one of the larger tombstones. Ignoring the instinct to flee, he edged closer, shining his light over the stone. There was nothing there. No sign of any movement, no footprints, no one hiding. His mind raced, trying to reason it out, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. As he stood there, a thick fog began to roll in, swirling around his legs and rising up until it obscured the tombstones. He could barely see more than a few feet in front of him. Then, out of the fog, a soft voice called his name, barely louder than a whisper. Lucas. His blood ran cold. It was impossible. No one should know his name. He tightened his grip on his flashlight, scanning the fog. The voice came again, softer, almost pleading. "Lucas, come find me." Against all logic, he felt compelled to move forward, as if some invisible force was guiding him deeper into the fog. He walked slowly, his pulse hammering in his ears, the voice continuing to call him, each time sounding more desperate. Finally, he found himself standing in front of an ancient-looking crypt. The iron door hung slightly open, revealing complete darkness inside. He hesitated, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. The voice came again, weaker now, like it was fading. "Please, don't leave me." Unable to resist, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The darkness swallowed him, his flashlight barely illuminating the narrow corridor that stretched before him. The walls were lined with stone alcoves, each one containing a coffin draped in dust. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, and he could hear his own breaths echoing in the small space. As he moved deeper into the crypt, the voice grew louder, coming from the far end. "Lucas, help me." It sounded so close now, just beyond the next alcove. He rounded the corner and stopped dead. In the last alcove lay an open coffin, its lid pushed aside. Inside was him. His own face, pale and lifeless, stared up at him, eyes open and unseeing. His body was dressed in the same uniform he was wearing now, even down to the flashlight lying next to his hand. He stumbled back, his mind reeling, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. His hand shook as he brought his light up, casting a beam over the rest of the crypt. In every alcove, in every coffin, he saw himself. Dozens of versions of him, each one in a different state of decay. Some looked as if they had been there for years, their faces rotting away. Others were fresh, their eyes open in silent terror. The voice was still calling him, now whispering urgently in his ear, though there was no one there. "You were always here, Lucas. You'll never leave." Desperate, he turned to flee, sprinting down the corridor, but the crypt stretched endlessly before him. No matter how fast he ran, he couldn't find the exit. The coffins continued to line the walls, each one containing his own lifeless body, his face frozen in fear. As the whispers grew louder, merging into a deafening chorus, he felt his legs give way. He collapsed onto the cold stone floor, his flashlight rolling from his hand, casting eerie shadows over his countless corpses. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was his own face staring back, eyes wide and hollow, as if it too was trapped in endless terror. The next night, the cemetery had a new guard, replacing Lucas, who'd never been seen again. And somewhere deep within the crypt, a new whisper began. Please, don't leave me.